Hello everyone, it is time for this week's live stream. We haven't been together in a couple of weeks and it's time to get caught up. I want to thank Fritz Aquatics for sponsoring my channel. I also want to thank Rogers Food because they have also been sponsoring this channel for the last few months. Their food is different than the normal frozen foods you get because it doesn't blow around in the tank. Instead, it stays in one spot for your fish to chew on it like a Thanksgiving dinner. I want to show you guys the brand new cover of Coral Magazine. This is the one going to press in a few days, well, in a couple days. And as soon as it goes to press, then, at some point it gets mailed out and goes everywhere. I'm really excited about this issue. It's a deep, deep issue. We talk a lot about rock and why it's important and all the choices. And we also talk about cold water reefs, which, by the way, just a quick hint, I want to let you know that we're going to bring on the guys that wrote the article in a future live stream because we've never talked about cold water reefs on this channel. Also, Alex wrote a beautiful article about diving in the seashells. I'm not even sure if I'm saying that right. And I was super excited to get that content from her. And there's more. There's a huge interview about adding those yellow tanks to the ocean. So, all that's coming out in this issue. If you're not a subscriber, that's the link right there. coralmagazine.com/Milev23. We'll save you a couple of bucks off a one-year subscription. You get 6 magazines in a year, one every 2 months. Gives you plenty of time to read it cover to cover a couple of times. And you will be more educated than you are right now. Please do subscribe. If you need help with your tank, I offer consultation services. Email me at sales@milevsreef.com and let me help you one-on-one via video chat. And here I am, guys. Hi. So, today's topic, I was trying to think what I want to talk about. And a few weeks ago, we talked about keeping, or how to make a water change station, how to build a station for the saltwater mix, how much water to save for RODI. And I thought, all right, well, now let's talk about changing the water. And I got a bunch of props next to me for today, so to be a little bit more interactive and not just me talking so much. And I hope that you enjoy some of the visuals I've got in mind. I hope that you guys have had a good weekend so far. We're in December. We're coming up on the holidays. I don't even know what you're thinking about getting for Christmas or Hanukkah or any other holidays, but you could give yourself the gift of Coral Magazine or you could give it to someone you love. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Again, I'm going to keep pushing it because you have to subscribe this weekend to get the next issue. And if you wait till sometime next week, what ends up happening is you miss the window. And then you don't get the next issue, you get the following one, which is like in 3 months. It's forever in the future. And so then you're thinking, well, I paid, why am I waiting? It's because you missed that window. You got to get it done this weekend. All right, so I want to talk about mixing salt. So here is some Fritz salt. I use the Fritz Blue Box. And if you're wondering what brand that is, maybe this bucket here will help a little bit. So this is the Fritz RPM, and you need a handy bucket, of course, to mix your salt in, or something much, much bigger. And when we're trying to figure out how much salt to use, I recommend a calculator. So I even grabbed that for you here. Let me jump over there. So this right here, let me get this off my screen. Oh, it won't let me. This right here is the direct salt addition calculator. And I find this, let me get that off of there. Well, actually, let me make my face in here. Can I make this thing show me a photo? I don't know. Oh, hang on. Now if I do it, I'll just get this off of here. Sorry. All right, so if you have an aquarium that's, let's say, 100 gallons, and your salinity is measuring 0, just completely, it's a clean bucket, there's nothing in there at all, and you want to go to 35 ppt, your temperature of the water is 77 degrees, then you would tell it to calculate, and it would say you need 35 pounds of salt to raise your salinity. Now, if, let's say you were mixing some salt water with some fresh water, and what I mean is you've got leftover salt water in your barrel, you're topping it off with more RODI to fill it up to the top. Let's say we've got a 33-gallon trash can, and you measure the salinity, and it's 1.09, for example, ppm, or I'm sorry, specific gravity, and we want to go to 1.026 specific gravity. We do the calculation, and it says you need 7.6 pounds of salt. So you see, you could actually figure out how much more salt you need to add to a solution that already is a little bit salty. This has happened to me on occasion. I will have like 10 gallons of water left in the bottom of my big vessel, and I might be 1.003, so it's super low, but it's definitely not zero. And I've got 250 gallons of water to mess with. I want to get it to 1.026. I hit calculate, and it says I need 77.52 pounds of salt. Sometimes, of course, I'm at 0 or 1.000. And I would calculate it, and like I was going to say 88 pounds. That's the number I'm used to seeing. But there are times where I just did this not long ago. I had some salt water in there. It was probably about a third full, so there's probably about 75 gallons of salt water. But I wanted to fill it up good so I could make a big batch of salt water. And so I was like, all right, I got 75 gallons in there. I'm going to let the RODI fill it up, and it let it just keep going and going and going. And then finally it was full to the top, and I was at my 250 gallon water volume. And then I checked my salinity, and it was 1.007. I told it to calculate, and it said I needed 64 pounds. All right, so I just wanted to show you that as a demo to help you understand. Now, when you've got that number, pounds isn't exactly written on the bag necessarily, especially not the ones I buy. I just buy the nondescript white bag. There are different kinds of packaging for different salt brands, and each bag might have some weight on it possibly, or might say what this bag will mix up to, but there's some wiggle room there, because let's say this was like a bag that said makes 50 gallons, okay, whatever the poundage is. You might mix it up at 1.026, and you didn't have enough salt to get to that number. And then someone else might mix it at 1.021 or 1.023, and they got it, and it worked out to where they actually got the 50 gallons. Did that make sense? My brain was going faster than my words. So some of the variance can happen. Again, salinity is number one. I always recommend 1.026 to everyone. I never recommend lower numbers. The fish store uses lower numbers to maintain their fish systems and higher numbers for their invertebrates and corals. So if you were to ever buy a fish and you took a sample out and stuck it under your refractometer, which is this guy right here, and you wanted to see what is the salinity of the water, you would take your little plastic pipette, here you go, and you would scoop a little bit of water out of the bag with the fish in it, and you'd lift this lid, and you'd put 3 drops, drop, 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 close the lid, and then you'll put this up to your eye, and you look at a bright source of light. If you look at somewhere dark, it's hard to make it out. You want to look at the sun, basically, and when you look, you'll see. And inside here is a scale with a whole bunch of numbers, and the whole scale is essentially blue when this is dry. But when you add the water, part of it becomes white. That's usually the case. Sometimes it's the opposite. It could be all white and you add some salt water and it becomes blue. But you want to see where the horizon line lines up with the grid, and that will tell you what your salinity is, and then you know if you need to add more salt to get the salinity up, or if you need to add more RO water to bring the salinity down because you put in too much salt. That's why you use the calculator to figure out exactly how much you need, and it works so well. Now, I'm kind of jumping around, but I want to stay on topic with the refractometer for a second. You took a sample out of the bag with a fish, and you stuck it in here, and you measured, and you looked up here, and you said, oh, it's 1.018. That's weird. Take it out, dry it off, put 3 more drops of the same water from the bag, check a second time. Check 2-3 times just to verify. And if you keep getting the same number, perfect. If you're getting different numbers, it's usually the last one. These are called auto temp compensating refractometers. And so they basically adjust based on the temperature of the water. But you might need to do a couple of tests to kind of get the glass warmed up, so to speak. That's my opinion. These devices can be calibrated. There's on mine's a little rubber cap that I will try to peel off here. So right here is a little screw hole. And inside here, I have an adorable, tiny, little itty-bitty screwdriver. And I would put this in here, and I would look through it, and then I would twist left or right. When I have calibration solution on the refractometer, I only recommend using 35 ppt calibration solution. If you are using RO water to calibrate this, you are doing it wrongly. And I know there's going to be some debate about that. And there are a few manufacturers that actually say use RODI water, but you're calibrating to the wrong end of the scale. You're calibrating to 0. You need to calibrate near salinity because that's the number we care about. So if you're shooting for 35 ppt all the time, then you want to calibrate to 35 ppt, not to 0. That's like, I want to adjust my heater, so let me put ice in my thermostat. You know, it makes no sense. You need to calibrate to the proper temperature. The same with pH. We run a tank that's around 8.0 to 8.3, so we calibrate between 7 and 10. We don't calibrate to 0 with a pH probe. We definitely don't want to calibrate to 4.0. We want to get 7 to 10 because 8's in the middle. When it comes to refractometers, it's always best to calibrate to 35 ppt. I sell that solution. You can buy it on Amazon. You can buy it everywhere. It's not like I'm cornering the market on this stuff. But if you are trying to calibrate, use a few drops of 35 ppt on here. Look up at the light. Use your screwdriver to adjust it slightly. Get that to where the line that I told you, that horizon, sits on 35. And this is calibrated. And if you don't drop this, if you're cautious with it, like I am, it never gets out of calibration. Now, I do adjust it once, or I check it once a year, and the rest of the time it goes in this case that has all these nice little slots to keep it nice and safe. I set it in there. I put back my little pipette so I never have to look for it. I put my little screwdriver in there, and I put this right here next to all my test kits, and I never have to hunt it down, okay? If you just kind of fling it around and you drop it in the bottom of a bucket, or if you drop it down into a barrel of salt water, it's probably toast. Just telling you, it's meant to have 3 drops on it, not get fully submerged. I've watched my fish store take the refractometer and dip it into the barrel of water and close the lid and look, and I'm like, wow! But maybe because they do it all day, or maybe because they replace it frequently, but 3 drops is all you need. Okay. Now, if you use the same refractometer and you want to measure the water of like peppermint shrimp you just bought, or an emerald crab, or an anemone, or an SPS coral, or an LPS coral, you'll find the salinity is higher. So, anyway, I always recommend 1.026. That is your ideal number. That's the same. It's actually 1.0265 is what matches 35 ppt, or part per 1,000. So if you were to... if you're struggling with ICP testing and you can't seem to get certain levels correct, the first question I'm going to ask you is your salinity 35 ppt? And if it is, your numbers are going to be accurately reflecting what's going on in the tank. But if you're running your tank at 34 ppt or 33.9 or something lower, it can skew the results of the test. Literally affect all the numbers of the different elements, and you're sitting there, I gotta add more manganese, I gotta add more cesium, I gotta add more cobalt. But if you get to 35 ppt, those other numbers might actually look correct because they all interact best at 35 ppt. I know it's weird, and I didn't accept that until it was explained to me by a physicist, and I was like, oh. And I was so mad at myself for not listening sooner, because he kept saying, fix your salinity. I kept thinking, I'm trying to fix these elements. I don't care about salinity. I can do later. Let me just get these numbers up so I have more colorful corals. That was my brain. And he kept saying to me, you haven't adjusted your salinity. And I was like, oh, I did. Why does he keep bringing this up? So that is my number one advice to you, is get your salinity correct. If your salinity gets higher for some reason, your aquarium evaporates a bunch of water and the salinity gets higher, you may see detrimental effects in your tank. That does not mean you should run a lower salinity just in case, because you might not top off your tank. That is not good reef keeping. You want to put in top off daily on the aquarium as needed to maintain the salinity. But if for some reason it does wander high, you may see something react. Like, for example, your zoanthids might all close up. And usually when I see them closed up, my first thought is the salinity too high? Or do you have a hippo tang that's chewing on them? Because that happens. Those are a couple of my personal caveats when it comes to zoanthids. But if they're open, usually your salinity is where it needs to be. So it's just a nice visual when you're glancing in your aquarium. It's not an absolute, it's just a suggestion, or just a little way to see if there's a red flag in the tank. It's sort of like How's your alkalinity? Well, if your zinnia is all closed up, alkalinity is probably out of whack. It's just one of those things. You just learn it over time. Okay, so we've got our calculator. We are mixing our salt. Now, here's the thing. There's only really a right way to mix salt water, so I'm going to go into that because we want to avoid mistakes. And a big mistake would be to grab your container, whatever it is, and put all the salt in first and then add the water, especially adding the water slowly. Like, for example, let's say you had a big barrel, you brought it in, it makes 55 gallons, you grabbed a sack of salt, you cut it open, you poured it into the brand new clean barrel, and then you turned on your RO system and you let it trickle in the water at 4.16 gallons per hour, which is 100 gallons a day. And so it goes in very slowly. 12 hours later, it's finally filled to the top. But the problem is that the salt that was in the barrel in the first place, that the water started to hit. I mean, when it's trickling in so slowly, I forget what it is per minute. Hang on, let me figure that out really fast. How am I going to do that? Don't let me hit that button. Sorry, guys. Well. Oh, yeah. Okay, I'm doing my math over here because I don't like doing math in my head. Okay, I converted the water you're making with the RO system to milliliters. And if you could make 4.16 gallons an hour, you'd be making almost 16,000 milliliters in that time period. 15,745.6 milliliters. Divided by 60 is 262 milliliters. That's like one of those cute little bottles that you get of Prime or something like that. So if you were adding in a little tiny bottle of liquid into your pile of salt in the barrel every minute, it would be super salty. It would be so high that you're going to get chemical reactions that are going to lead to precipitation. You're not going to get the proper mix. That's why we don't put the salt in the barrel first. I just wanted to explain that a little bit more deeply rather than just say, just don't do it. I want you to know why. Now, if you were to get a big barrel, it's nice and clean. You put the RO tubing in there and you let it turn on, and 12 hours later it's full. Fantastic. Now you can add your salt. Some brands of salt may recommend you bring the temperature up of the barrel first to reef temperature, which is going to be somewhere around 76 degrees. If your water in the barrel is around 50 degrees, you may not get the salt dissolution you're looking for. You may end up seeing some salt crystals at the bottom that refuse to melt, but the majority of it will. It's just not nice to have salt at the bottom. We want everything to completely, fully saturate and be completely dissolved. So raising the temperature might be your solution. Now, the brand of salt I'm using, Fritz, you put that into whatever your water is. That is per their own instructions. And then after you've mixed your salt water, you then go ahead and bring it up to temperature with a heater. And so I have specific things to make my life easier that I want to show you. First of all, we want to use a properly sized heater. So this one here is a cobalt heater. It's 100 watts. This is totally overkill for a 5-gallon bucket, but definitely will do the job. And it has a thermostat on the top, so you can quickly set it to something. Mine is set here to 84 degrees because I'm always in a hurry. But you could adjust this down to 78, and you could just put it in the barrel and plug it in. But you need water circulation, so I have more. You got a couple of choices. You could go in there with your arm every once in a while, and you could slosh it around, or you could use a power head. Now this here is a Cobalt MaxiJet 1200. I've had it forever. These little power heads have been around forever. I just said forever twice. 3 times now because I repeated it. Seche is another small pump you could use, and I have one a little bit bigger than what I wanted to show you. But this is the one that I use. And it is great because there's a fitting that screws on top that will accept flexible tubing. And you can set this in the bucket with the tubing on it if you like. That's up to you. But you could just put it in the bucket without this, or without fitting on but no tubing, and just turn it on and let it circulate the water in the barrel with the salt. So what I would do in the perfect, the perfect world scenario, I've got my bucket or my barrel of water. I put in my power head, I plug it in, now the water is spinning, and now I pour in my salt, and I don't pour it in all at once. Like, I don't just like, boom. Instead, I just trickle it in, and I watch it rain down in there, and I just keep going and going and going until I've used up all the salt I need for that volume of water, and this keeps it mixing, and in about 10 minutes, my water's crystal clear. Then you can put in the heater, bring it up to temperature, use a glass thermometer. I didn't bring one of those over here, sorry. But I buy lots of glass thermometers because I never can find them. I need to just like stick it in the glass thermometer spot on the wall. That's what I need, where it's always there, like break glass in case of emergency. That should be my glass thermometer spot, but I haven't done that. But glass thermometers are great because they bob on the water. They give you a quick temperature reading, or if it's not right yet, you can just wait a little bit longer until the heater has done its job to get the water up to the right temperature. Now, the other reason I like the pump, besides mixing the salt, is once the tubing is on there, you can pump the water from the barrel into your tank and not have to lift the bucket up and pour it into your tank. Because as you know, that can be a very difficult task. It's heavy, you're standing on a chair, you're trying not to lose your balance. You're on a step ladder. Again, you're trying not to hurt yourself, but things happen. And I know people that have fallen off chairs and off ladders working on their aquariums, and they end up with some kind of a brace on their leg, or they're having to have surgery, and it's going to take forever to heal, and they can't work on their tank at all. So instead, and I did this a long time ago, I filled up my 29 gallon, which was up on a nice tall stand at eye level, and I loved my aquarium, and I stood on the chair a few times with a bucket of water and said, this is insane. And so I got myself a pump, I got myself 10 foot of tubing, and I set the pump in the barrel, and I held the tubing on top, and I just squirted the water into the aquarium. So much easier, no lifting, and I mean, the only lifting I had to do was get the bucket from where I was mixing salt water next to the tank. But if you can make everything as simplified as possible, you're making it easier on your back, you're making it easier on getting water in the tank. You're also controlling the flow of water going in. If you are taking a bucket, I have all this stuff in here, let me take it out. If you take a bucket like this, and you're holding it and you're pouring into your tank, you're pouring it in. It's going in pretty quickly. But if you're pumping it in through small tubing, you can kind of control the flow rate. Now I grabbed some handy tubing I had here. I got this blue tubing, okay? I got a whole bunch of it. And I want to show you this tubing for two reasons. Number one, it's too bendy. It's way too flexible. So what it probably will do when you don't want it to is it will probably kink a little bit, which slows the flow of water going through it, and that's problematic. But you do need to have tubing that will fit onto this fitting right here. Now, if you look at it, it sort of looks like it's the same diameter, and so it's going to be hard to push on. So I got a trick I want to show you. You grab yourself your handy coral mug. You fill it up with some water. You put it in the microwave for 3 minutes till it's nearly boiling hot. And then you take your tubing and you push it into that hot cup of water, and you wait about 20 seconds. And this part here will become extremely pliable. It'll be super duper soft. And then you can just take that nice hot tubing and you can just press it onto your fitting. See, I'm trying to demonstrate something I didn't do because we don't have time for the microwave, okay? But now we've got this nice connection, okay? And so now I've got this down inside my bucket and it's pushing water up into my tank. And then something else you can do on the other end, if you want to make your life a little bit easier, you could take the tubing that goes up to the tank and you could find yourself some kind of appropriate fitting. You know, we all have extra aquarium gear, extra equipment that we ended up not using, and it had fittings that didn't come in handy. You may have something from a canister filter or a hang-on back filter or something like that you could press into this tubing, and you could hook it on the tank, and you could literally take this and go and hang it on the tank and let it just pour the water into your aquarium gradually until the bucket runs dry. That would be super nice and easy. You're not having to sit there and babysit it. But the biggest thing you don't want to do is put the tubing in and kind of have your hand on there and grab your phone and you kind of let go because it's staying good. And the next thing you know, it's on the floor squirting water everywhere and you're flooding your room. So you've got to make sure it stays. But you could build something out of PVC pipe that will fit a hose barb connection, and you could literally make a hook that will just go, from here, hook over the top, and then maybe has an elbow pointing forward, and you just set the whole apparatus on the aquarium, and it's just like squirting water forward and not blowing down on your corals. It's kind of spraying in. You can get as creative as you want. You could use one of those fan lock line fittings. You could put lock line on the end if you really want to point it a certain direction. There's a lot of different choices. The idea is to make this as simple and bulletproof as possible, so you'll do the job and you won't procrastinate and hold off because it's a hassle, or because you got to hold it and you've got other things you got to do at the same time. So that was just something I want to bring up into mind. Now, once you've made a lot of different batches of salt water over time, you kind of learn. Now, we had that calculator that we used earlier that told us how much salt to use. But if you find that you're always making a brand new batch in its entirety to use for the full water change with no leftover, you're probably going to be doing something like, I only mix up a 5-gallon bucket. I do this every single time I do it. I use 5 gallons and I'm done. If that's the case, you probably won't need the calculator but 2 or 3 times just to kind of learn what the number needs to be. Because odds are it's not going to be 12 cups. It's going to be 12 cups, a quarter cup, and a tablespoon or something like that to get to your 35 ppt. And so if you learn what that is exactly, that amount of salt that you need every single time for the exact same salinity, you could basically find some kind of container that can hold that much salt, or you can just weigh it like we talked about earlier, and you just know it has to be, 15 pounds every single time, or whatever the number is. And what I did in my case, I had this larger container that was it was sort of like a Rubbermaid or a Tupperware, some kind of a hard plastic thing that had a lid that peeled off, and I lost the lid a long time ago. But I knew if I added salt into that container, 1 inch from the top, every single time my salinity was always the same in my 55-gallon barrel. Super convenient for me. I never had to sit there and scoop and then say, was that 12 or 13? Which cup was I on? Because as you're going 1, 2, 3, sometimes you lose count. Sometimes you make a mistake. And so if you have a way to know what the total amount is, you can't make that mistake. You can't put too much accidentally or too little because you have this vessel with a line inside it. Like, for example, I keep showing you this big blue bucket. What if the amount of salt you needed could be held in a small 1-gallon bucket? You could put in the correct amount of salt in there, and then you could take a Sharpie and you could put a line on the inside of that bucket, and then from now on you keep the small bucket with the 5-gallon bucket, and then every time it's time to make a batch of salt water, you fill up the bucket with RODI water, you take your little 1-gallon bucket, you pour in salt up to the black line, or whatever color Sharpie you used, and then you can add that gradually into your circulating water to dissolve it fully, and 10 minutes later, or the next morning, your salt water is going to be ready to use for your aquarium. Now, the reason I say or the next morning, I'm actually not a fan of mixing water and immediately using it 20 minutes later. Some people do that. I don't. I prefer to let it age a little bit, a day or two. I like to just circulate. And what I mean is I have the salt all in there. The temperature's right. I can lay a lid across the top so it doesn't get polluted by anything. And I leave the power head plugged in. I leave the heater plugged in if it's cycling on and off. If your heater is one of those ones that is your backup heater that really doesn't turn off, then probably unplug it for the duration. It doesn't need to be kept at 76 the entire time. But it definitely has to match your aquarium's temperature when it comes time to do the water change. So if you were mixing this water now and it's Thursday and you're going to do your water change on Saturday, you may not need to bring the temperature up until Saturday morning. That morning you plug in the heater and give it however long it takes to get that temperature up. And that all comes down to the wattage of the heater. If you put in some crazy 800 watt heater, it'd probably be heated up pretty quick. But if you have a 25 watt heater, it could take days to get to temperature. It's just comes down to the wattage. But, normally 3 watts per gallon heats water beautifully. So if you have a 5-gallon bucket, technically you only need a 15 watt heater. So me having a 100 watt heater is kind of a little bit, like I said, it's overkill, but it does the job and comes on, and because of that thermostat, it turns itself off and doesn't heat the water too much. And the pump from Seachay or the MaxiJet, those don't add enough heat to heat the water either. 20 years ago when I'd mixed my salt water with a mag pump, those heaters, the engine block was so warm, it was heating the water at the same time it was circulating. It was kind of a dual duty thing and made my life a lot easier. So I was able to do that. Now, how often should you change your water? This is the part I mentioned in the description. Are you doing it too much? Is it overkill? Are you wasting your time changing water so frequently? Saltwater aquariums are not the same as freshwater, and freshwater people change water every single week. You do not need to change water in your aquarium every single week. You especially don't need to change water frequently on a tank that was set up with dry sand and dry rock where your bacteria load is so low. Because every time you're changing the water, you're diluting the pollution, right? And you need some pollution in your tank to establish a nice ecosystem. That tank behind me there in the background, it's actually growing coralline, and I've done nothing to dose to it. All I do is feed the tank and make sure that the top of it doesn't run out, and I've done a couple of water changes on it. That's it. And there's pink dots all over the glass right now that I need to scrape away. But if you're changing the water so frequently, you could be basically, and I know this word is overused, but you could be stripping it of all the nutrients and stripping it of all the pollutants to the point where your water is actually too clean, and you end up with a tank with zero phosphate, zero nitrate, and you end up with dinoflagellates. And we definitely don't want dinos. You guys know how I felt about dinoflagellates. I've been struggling with it with Caitlin's Reef since February, and here's a picture from last night. Look at that. That tank looks clean. It ain't perfect, I know, but it's clean. I actually thought I beat the dinos about 10 days ago, and I cleaned the top of the tank thoroughly. I have this sheet of acrylic on top. I don't remember if I mentioned this. And I allowed the algae to grow over it completely as a thick, dense, reddish, rusty mat to where hardly any light would penetrate into the tank. And I just thought, I'm going to starve the dinos of light, but I'm not going to put it in pitch darkness. And I probably had it like that for a month or longer. And finally I said, let me go ahead and clean up the tank and scrape that off the lid and let the light shine in and see what happens. And I've been watching this tank like a hawk for the last 10 days, and the sand has not graduated back to that brownish stuff. This picture is unaltered. It's literally, I just took a shot with my phone as is. I didn't do any kind of post-editing, and you can see that the sand is nice and clean. There is the slightest dusting of brown in the front right corner that you can kind of barely make out if you try super hard to look for it. But essentially, I think the dinos are completely behind me, and I can take the UV system off the back. I can get that ugly frag rack out of the back corner that just spoils the look. I can start putting in some other things in the tank now and find some kind of a pretty fish to add. Right now, all that's in there is a Randall goby. Let's see if I can scroll in so you can see him. Hang on one second here. So he is right, well, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse, but he's right in that low spot under the Gorgonian between the two rocks. He's facing us. That's his little mouth right there. So anyway, he is in there with a pistol shrimp, and I feed 1 pipette of food each day, and that seems to suffice. So, okay, so how often should you change the water? The old school rule of thumb was 25% of the water should be changed once a month. Nowadays, everyone is promoting doing daily water changes of a small amount. Like, I'm changing 3% daily. Well, 3% daily times 30 days is 90% of your tank. 1% of your tank daily would be 30% of your tank. 30% is still greater than the 25% once a month. So how much do you really need to change the water in your tank? That will come down to the bioload. That'll come down to the parameter issues you're concerned with. You know, are you constantly dealing with high nitrate and high phosphate? And you absolutely have to do these to get those numbers down because nothing else works. What type of livestock is in the tank that's causing this? Because if you had like a tank with puffer fish that are super messy eaters, yeah, your water's going to be polluted. And yeah, I could see you needing to do larger water changes because of that livestock. But if you have an SPS reef, how much crap is getting into the system? You know, how heavily are you feeding that tank realistically? You might have a smattering of fish in there and you're feeding them once or twice a day with a little bit of food, and the fish are pooping into the water column and the corals are catching that and eating that, and you may not actually need to change water nearly as much. Randy Holmes Farley did an article a very long time ago in reefkeeping.com. You can go look it up, where he talked about doing water changes and doing a percentage every single day versus doing one once a month. And he broke it all down in a huge, super long article. And in the end, he basically said, the same thing accomplishes the same purpose. So it really just comes down to what you want to do. Now, what is the upside of doing an automatic water change? You never have to lift a bucket. That's the idea. It gets done while you're sleeping. It's completely automated. It pulls out 3 gallons out of your tank and puts 3 gallons in. You don't have to worry about temperature or alkalinity or anything because it's such a tiny amount going into the full system that you don't have to worry about things matching. When I'm suggesting you change 25% at one time, like on my tank, it's a 400 gallon, I have to change 100 gallons, right? I match my salinity, I match my temperature, and I match my alkalinity. If you don't want to use alkalinity as a comparison, which I feel is the easiest test ever, you could measure the pH of both. Now, for that, you have to have a pH probe that's loose, like in a pH meter or a pH pen, where you can put it in the tank, it says 8.1, and you put it in the vat, it says 6.9. You're like, oh! And you're like, I need to buffer this up to make them match. And in that case, you buffer it up with some soda ash, which is baked baking soda. Bring it up to match the tank. It's 8.1. The tank is 8.1. I can do my water change. It's really easy. When you're doing a water change like I'm recommending, the 25%, you may be draining that much water out of your aquarium, or you may be pumping the water out of your sump and your refugium. Like literally you're taking water out. If you're taking water out of the sump and the refugium area, any compartment down beneath the tank, you won't expose the corals in the tank to air. But if you're pumping water out of the display tank, of course the water goes down, 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 and your corals are all being exposed to air for a duration. And the room temperature matters at that point too. So for example, let's say I was draining 200 gallons out of my 400 gallon tank. My tank would essentially look half empty, correct? If my house was being kept at 65 degrees, my corals would feel 65 degree air during the time period while the water is out and before the water goes in. Now, if my room temperature is 75 degrees, 76 degrees, the corals aren't going to be affected by temperature whatsoever. They're just going to be affected by air. And of course, they are going to push out some kind of a mucus, a slime coat to protect themselves, or even a way to wash themselves clean. So when the water comes in, it all sloughs away and blows into the overflow box and down the drain into the filter socks, the protein skimmer, etc. But we just want to make sure that what we're doing, when we're doing it, the time of year, how are we affecting the corals? If you can get the water out and back in within 10 minutes flat, the temperature of the room probably won't be critical. If you're going more slowly and it takes you 30, 45 minutes to get this job accomplished, then yeah, the room temperature could be a problem. So that's why I've always liked and preferred to go ahead and drain the water out of the sump, drain the water out of the refugium zone. So I take it out of the skimmer section, I take it out of the return zone, and then maybe some out of the refugium, or even if I want to clean the refugium and I'm trying to pump stuff out of there, then I've removed 70, 80 gallons out of my sump. Then if I need to really take it to like 100 or 125 gallons, I can take out another 20 to 45 gallons out of the tank, but 90% of my reef is still underwater. Just the tips of the tallest corals are going to be exposed briefly. And even then, if you're in a process where you're going slowly, for whatever reason, you're trying to remove skeletons from the tank, you're trying to remove snails, or you're just doing things, you can grab yourself some kind of a cup of some kind. I'm sorry, I don't have a really good one here. But you could take some tank water and pour it over the corals that are exposed to air just to keep them wet. And then, continue with whatever task you're doing. Maybe you're trying to peel an anemone out of the system and it's taking you longer than you anticipated while the water line was low. But then as soon as you get this job done, we got to refill it. Well, we want to keep all those corals nice and wet as long as possible. Okay, I wanted to talk about cleaning things out of your sump really quick. I brought something else to show you. It's here somewhere. There it is. So VCA came out with an attachment a few years ago that is their vacuum attachment, and I love this thing. The first one was just the scoop that looks like what you'd use to vacuum the inside of your vehicle, to clean your seats off or to vacuum the carpet area of your truck or your vehicle. Then he came out with this new one with a cover that goes on the top, and this is the one I sell for my shop. It's like $10. And you would attach this to your power head. This fits the MaxiJet perfectly. It also will fit, there's an attachment for the Seache pump. And then you put your tubing on the other end here. And now you have this really nice vacuum system to clean all the detritus out of your sump. And it works really, really well. I did a video one time showing how I did this, and I was being super slow motion and taking my time, and it probably gave the viewer the impression it's super slow and it's going to take forever. It's really not slow at all. I was just trying to do a good video. So I don't know that I need to make a new video, but the point is, you just go in there, you've got this weird patch of detritus in one part of your sump, you just set this guy in there, you run the tubing into a nearby bucket, and you just vacuum clean until it's gone. It's really nice. And if for some reason this clogs up, you can peel this thing off the end, you can hit it inside the bucket 2-3 times, and then you snap it back on. Or you can leave it off and just use this part here to vacuum larger bits of gravel and stuff. But it may possibly get clogged up in this part here. So you may have to, take it and tap it on the edge of the sump a few times or inside your bucket. Or you might even get some stuff in here that you need to clean out to make sure it keeps doing its vacuum job. But the idea is that you can vacuum out all the detritus and have a nice clean sump, which sumps are usually down to the floor level. So you need a pump to do this. This is the nicest, easiest way. It's super inexpensive. Typically, you own the power head already. You just need an attachment. But if you need both parts, you know what to do. Just buy it, add to cart, and then just some tubing. It's super easy to get the filth out of your system. In my refugium, I didn't use sand this time. I used Two Little Fishies Reborn Media, which is like big nuggets of aragonite-based media. And I can take all that stuff and shove it over and expose a whole bunch of detritus, and I can vacuum out all the detritus and then push the gravel over, do another spot, and kind of work my way across and really clean it. And it's actually time for me to do that. It's been a couple of years since I did that, and I'd like to go ahead and get that area cleaned up a little bit so that the refugium has less waste trapped in the substrate. All right. What else? If your saltwater is too hot, one of the ways you can cool it down is ice. If you are wanting to, or even ice packs, you might have those frozen bricks in your freezer, and you can float a few in your saltwater. Now, I wouldn't just use raw ice cubes unless you have really good water. I run my RODI system, well, the RO system, to my ice maker of my refrigerator, so I literally have RO ice cubes all the time. And the TDS of my RO water is around 2 or 3 after my membrane. So I really have really good ice cubes. The ice itself is almost crystal clear, which proves to me how little impurities it has. So I could actually use RO water. I'm sorry, I could use my own ice cubes. But you can always buy a bag of ice from the store or take the ice cubes out of your freezer, put them in a Ziploc bag, and stick that inside your salt water to help cool it down because it's too warm. It might be too warm because your source water was affected by the temperature of the year. It's summer and the water's really hot. You mixed up the water in your garage and your garage is really hot. You plugged in a heater and you left it turned on and it made the water too hot. The pump you use is too big and made the water too hot. All these things could be why your water's too hot. And when I showed you guys the different water mixing stations, there was a guy who talked about his very hot garage, and he actually set up 2 chillers, one for the saltwater mix and one for the RO mix. And I was like, wow. I mean, that's an investment right there. But he could actually maintain the temperature of those barrels perfectly. In the summer, he could chill it. In the winter, he could heat it. His water was always ready all the time. But when we're dealing with smaller volumes, a bucket or a trash can or a 55-gallon barrel, these are different sizes that probably don't need a chiller. You might just need some ice to bring it down or get it indoors to where the room is normal temperature and wait a day and it just equalize to the room temperature. And then that could be another method. And then finally, of course, you could use evaporative cooling. You could put a big box fan on top to blow down on the water to help cool it down as well. But you got to wait until it finally gets to the right temperature before you can use it. We definitely do not want to put in water that is too hot, too cold, the wrong salinity, the wrong alkalinity, the wrong... that's it. Those are the 3. We want to make sure those are absolutely the same, because if they match your reef perfectly, you can change a small amount or a large amount, and the reef does not care. There is no effect. There's no detrimental effect. And that is the most important part of all when it comes to reef keeping is stability. So we want to make sure everything matches. If you are in the camp of, I want automated water changes, I wanted to change 2 gallons a night every night, Your job is going to be to bring out that refractometer weekly and double check the salinity of your tank. People that have automatic water change systems tend to lean into the belief that their salinity is not going to change, that it's perfect all the time because you've got 2,000 milliliters going out, you got 2,000 milliliters going in, it's all the same, there's no way it can go wrong. It can go wrong. During this automatic water change, your top off might kick in. It could be that your skimmer has been pulling out a lot of waste lately and filling up with a lot of fluid, or going into a large waste collector, and so your top off is turning on much more frequently, adding more RO water to the system. And then your automatic water change may not be calibrated still like it was when you first set it up, and now it's adding more salt water or less salt water than what you're draining, and you might end up with an imbalance, and your salinity could start going down. And this has happened. I know it's happened to people. So if you check your salinity weekly, you can make sure that everything is staying on track. If you don't test it, and that's why I always talk about water test Saturday. If you don't test it, then one day you're like, man, my corals just don't look like they used to. It's so weird. Everything's fine. My app says everything's great. Everything's been dosing properly. My temperature looks right. And then you finally bring out that refractometer. You're like, why is my water 1.019? What happened? And then they say, oh, well, I hadn't used it in 6 months. I'm like, yeah, that's a problem. So we want to make sure that everything is the same week after week, and that's why water testing is so important. And it's great to have automation and have things that can do it for you so you don't have to wear yourself out physically. But at the same time, you need to double check that all the automation is working properly all the time. So you have to babysit it. It's you can't neglect it now that you've got it automated. Now you got more pieces to worry about to make sure they all are doing what they're supposed to do. Okay. I think that's it for now. I'd love to be able to answer any questions. I see someone said, no one's asked Mark when he did his last water change. That's hilarious. Okay, so I will bring that up really quick. I haven't done one in a while, and I think I mentioned in my previous live stream that I had a float valve that broke off in my big water vessel, and it filled it to the brim, overflowed it, and flooded my garage a little bit because I didn't replace it like I should have. I've had the new float valve sitting in the fish room, but I got to crawl up the ladder. I got to remove the old one, screw in the new one, get it connected to the tubing. It's just a thing that's not easy to do, and I just kind of was like, eh. So I overfilled my container. It's too full to add the salt. So I've been wanting to pump out some water down the driveway to get it down to the right height, and then, get the circulation pump going, fix the float valve so I never have to think about that again, and then add my salt and make a batch. And that's why I'm talking about water changes this weekend, because it's on my hit list. I'd love to get this done tomorrow so that it's done and I can do some water changes, because I want to change the water in this tank behind me. The little 1-gallon tank needs a water change as well. Caitlin's reef probably could use one now that I'm dino free. And then my main reef, I want to get in there and do some cleaning, and I need some salt water to do all that. All right. By the way, if you're wondering where I was last weekend, I have something I can show you that's not done. So my son came up here for his birthday and said, I'll help you build your deck. And this was shot last Sunday. The whole frame is made out of green wood, treated lumber. And then the black tape is a type of tape to protect the joists from rotting out from, rainwater sitting on top of the wood. And then I have all the boards in the background. You can see at the very end there, I've got the Trex boards that are ready to go on top. But I've needed more of the supports to level the deck itself completely. And the supports didn't show up until about 2 days ago, finally. So I got those in, and of course the weather's bad right now. It's cold, it's windy, it's raining, so it's waiting. But as soon as I can get all my little supports in place, I know it's all perfectly level with the house, then I can go ahead and start applying the boards on top, which will make it a lot easier for Jack to get in and out of that door that you see right there. But it was a process, and we had to work with my environment, with the changes that are going on with the different elevations, with where the house is, where the pipes are sticking out of the wall, where all the valves are for the sprinkler system. All that had to come into play. I'm very excited to get this done. It's been on my hit list for 2 years, and the best part is that once it's done, I'll have this nice big wide open area to have a table and a couple of chairs. I can have my grill out there like I always do, but on a nice clean area. I will stick a hot tub over there on the left side that I picked up a few weeks ago. It was really funny because I did this work with my son, and it involved a lot of squatting and standing up and carrying things and putting them down and and loading the truck and unloading the truck, the whole process, right? And both of us were crazy sore. And I called him up. I mean, it was that soreness you get like when you go to the gym for the first time in 5 years and you're doing all the machines, and then all of a sudden everything hurts super bad. That's what we both felt like, right? And it was so bad. And I called him up and I said, what would be really great right now, when I'm so super sore? That hot tub. But I can't use it yet because there's no deck yet, and the hot tub's not been set up yet. It is sitting, I picked it up at Costco, and it's under a tarp right now so the rain doesn't rot whatever's in the box. But I got an inflatable, cheap, small, personal hot tub. It holds 2 people, and I just wanted something small I could get in there, make my back feel better. But I haven't been able to use it yet, and man, did I need it last Monday and Tuesday. I was hurting, and I'll share a little insight with you guys because it's hilarious, and I love to embarrass myself because it's funny. But the worst part of the soreness was when I needed to sit down on the toilet. It wasn't I had to go to the toilet all the time, but when I needed to sit down, all the muscles in my body are like, are you kidding me? Why are you trying to sit? And I was like, ow, ow, ow. It was really funny. But I survived it. I feel better now. And even my son, I talked to him last night, and he said, I'm so glad the soreness is gone. I was like, yeah. And I said, you want to come back up here and help me put the top boards on? He's like, nope, I'm relaxing this weekend. I'm watching movies. I'm not doing that. So, while we're talking about TV things and things that have nothing to do with reef keeping, I want to mention, if you haven't watched it yet, the first 2 episodes of Disney Plus has the new Star Wars Skeleton Crew. It's really good. If you were a big fan of the Goonies, the movie, which I love and watch every so often, this series has the feeling of the Goonies. So if you haven't checked it out yet, check it out and tell me what you think. I'd love to hear your opinions. Okay, let's answer some questions because that's part of this. And let me find this right here. All right. Okay, so first question that came up was Titus says, have you ever maintained all the amazing stuff you get growing in on live rock, or does it always die back? That is a great question. So I'm going to throw this picture on the screen again one more time because it was a good example of a tank that's been running now for over 2 years. And I can zoom in a little bit. So this rock right here came from Gulf Live Rock, which is South Florida, and it had clams, it had tunicates, it had cup corals, hidden cup corals, and it had some different macroalgae, and those continue to live on this tank. I mean, the sponges, all that stuff, I still have it in this tank. And so, yes, you can maintain it. And, it's a great question you ask this because the fact is that so often, especially when you order live rock, the rock may come in covered in really cool critters and tunicates and things, and then it smells like death, and you're like, oh, I need to cure it. And curing it just means to put it in a vat of salt water and let it get through a cycle of its own, separate from the system, unless your system's brand new. If your system's brand new, it can cycle in the tank because your tank needs a cycle anyway. And in that case, the ammonia level will rise and then fall. The nitrite will rise, then fall. And then the nitrate will raise and fall. And during that period, you could lose some of the livestock that's on the live rock. That is a possibility. But if you're providing some food to the rock and you're providing some light to the rock during that weird cycle period, you could potentially protect them. Now, in my situation, I use some live rock enhance because Tulio called me up and says, Mark, absolutely use that with your brand new live rock. I was like, okay, I wasn't thinking about it, but I just did it. But it actually backfired for me. I might have used too much or something, but the tank got super bacterially cloudy, and I was actually freaked out because I was like, there's so much cool life in here, and I feel like I'm killing it all. And I stuck an air stone in there immediately to oxygenate it, and it took a full day or so to clear up, and I did lose a couple of the big, huge hitchhiker clams that were on there, but a third one didn't die, so that was really nice, and I did like that. The hidden cup corals have been with me the whole time. There's some hidden cucumbers. I didn't even know what that was. So it's a cucumber you never see, but there's like this flowery looking thing that sticks out that has very, very dainty fronds, I guess you could say. And those are still in the tank to this day. And there was 5 back then. There's still 5 now, which is really neat. So yes, you can keep some of those things. Ideally, if you can, and I'll just so you know, and I'll put this on the screen too because it relates. This issue right here talks so much about live rock, dry rock, what's it called? My brain is thinking porcelain. That's the wrong word. But there's ceramic. There are ceramic rocks. There's a lot of different rocks on the market. The live rocks from certain companies can be shipped to you immersed in water and keep everything alive on the rock upon arrival. So you definitely want this magazine so you can get your insight on all things rock for 2025. I highly, highly, highly recommend you read this one. I hope you guys love it. We'll just enjoy the crap out of it because it's been a lot of work putting that magazine together, and we have used every inch of the paper yet again. I am the king of content. I mean, like the videos I do, they're long. I don't do quick 1-minute videos. Can't stand them. And, why would I have short articles in Coral? No, they're long, they're in depth. They go into a lot of detail. There's a lot of visuals to help, really paint the picture for you. And a lot of explanation, a lot of research goes into everything, and a lot of painstaking debate over should we say this or should we say that? Did that come across correctly? Does it read like the author intended? Does it make sense? Is there something lacking that would make it make more sense? A lot of that goes on, and I'm so glad we're near the end of this issue. But yeah, great question. Thank you for asking that. I do think the amazing things on Live Rock should be kept alive. Oh, by the way, this calculator that I used, I want to stick the link. I did stick it in the video's description, but I'm going to stick it here in the live chat too, so you've got it there. That way you guys can copy and paste it and bookmark it and save it forever. Steve says, I just used that salt app today to know how much to mix 1 gallon to 1.020 for Artemia and phytoplankton. It was 0.44 cups. Nice. I didn't know that it would do it in cups. Let me take a look at that. See, this calculator says pounds, kilograms, and grams. But if you have some kind of a scale, and I use a scale for my business, to ship all the packages I do, and so I can literally take this bag of salt, stick it on there, and like this one here probably is 11 pounds. And then, the next bag is fuller, of course, because this is a partially used bag. It might be more like 13. Actually, this is more like 8 pounds. But usually it's around between 11 and 13 pounds per bag. And so I'll weigh the bag, I weigh the next bag, I add them all up to see where I'm at. And then I know I need a partial bag. And that's what I used the last time I was making a batch to hit that 88 pounds that I needed to mix up my barrel, my big, huge poly tank. Titus says, are you sure we should look at the sun? Well, you're not looking at the sun. You're pointing it at the sun. You're looking at the brightest source of light possible, but you're looking through the refractometer, and you're only seeing the scale. You are not seeing the sun, I promise. It's not like looking through a telescope. The refractometer is such a great device. It's so accurate. It's so easy to use. And once you buy one, you just kind of have it forever. Will it last forever? Depends. Just depends how you treat it. Mine, I think I'm on my second one in 25 years or so. So, it's a great investment. And they're not super expensive. What are they, 40 bucks? Okay. Ben Hur says, what about for mixed tanks? Is 1.026 for the fish? Is 1.026 okay for the fish? Yes, it is. The fish are not going to have a problem with salinity. Most of them don't. Now, the funny thing about fish, when it comes to a reef tank, or to a real natural reef, is that they will swim up and down to find what they want, but usually they're not looking for salinity. You might think they were, but they're really not. They're usually looking for temperature. So if the water feels a little too warm, they swim down to find an eddy of cooler water. because they feel more comfortable. And if they're feeling too chilled, they can work their way up to a warmer zone. And that's usually what they're doing. They're not hunting down salinity to get, where's that spot of 1.026 in this lagoon? I know it's here somewhere away from that stream. I got to find that spot. That's not what happens. And I realize there could be, there may even be later on some debate, me pushing for 1.026, but that really is the ideal overall salinity for our systems. There are going to be some proprietary biotopes that you're trying to recreate that's literally all these animals from this section of the earth, and it's only these animals and nothing else, and it's only the invertebrates and nothing else. And yeah, you might be in a situation where you need lower salinity for that case, but then you're probably not doing ICP testing. You're probably not trying to grow SPS corals. It could be something more brackish, for example, to where you're having things that are, softies, are corals that don't care as much. They're not nearly as demanding, is what I'm trying to say. And so salinity won't be as critical. But for a typical reef tank, and that's usually what whenever I think of someone having a saltwater aquarium, my brain defaults to reef tank, because why would you have anything less? How can you have an aquarium with some fish and not start putting in corals and invertebrates? I just don't understand it. But if you had a fish-only system, you could save money on lower salinity. But then again, like I said, you're not worrying about trace elements, and you're not worrying about alkaline and calcium and magnesium and all those things with a fish only. With fish, you care about fish, and usually you're just changing the water because you're trying to get excrement out of the water. You're trying to keep the nitrates from getting out of control, and that's it. You're not really dwelling on water chemistry. But when it comes to reef keeping and water chemistry, if you have a baseline of 35 ppt or 1.0265 specific gravity, that's really the one to shoot for. And I mentioned this earlier, but I don't know if I emphasized it enough. Some people feel like, well, if I keep it lower, then I don't run the risk of it getting too high accidentally. If you're testing weekly, it'll never get too high accidentally because you'll be all over it. You'll catch it early on. It's the people that don't do things. They don't test, they say everything looks fine, I'll do it tomorrow. And 3 months later, they finally do it. And they're like, wow, it's way off. I'm at 1 point. And this is something else people do. I've seen it happen in forums where people will say, my water's 1.035, everything's fine, but I have a question about why I keep dealing with such and such. And I'm like, wait, why is your water 1.035? They said, well, that's the number. I'm like, no. It's 35 ppt, or it's 1.026. It's never 1.035. That's way too high. I will mention, though, that I do recall we did an article about somewhere in Indonesia in Coral Magazine a year ago, and the water there was higher, like 1.031. And I think the Dead Sea is even higher in certain parts. But it also has fresh water pouring in, which is why the animals live in that water. They can actually handle the higher salinity because there's more fresh water coming in and they find that sweet spot. So that might be the one place in the ocean where they do look for a specific level of salinity to survive. I'm retracting what I said earlier. Lord Thornton says, I highly recommend the glass thermometer from Tropic Marin. Glass hydrometer from Tropic Marin. It's 100% dead accurate. It's fragile, but you can use it to double check your refractometer or your Hanna checker. He says in parentheses, my Hanna is always off. The hydrometer from Tropic Marin is a very delicate piece of scientific equipment. It is set and calibrated to be 1.026 or 35 ppt forever, as long as you never drop it. It comes in a big hard shell. It's something you have to be very cautious with. You have to keep it clean. Do not let it roll off the counter. It will not bounce. It will break. I had one in the past, and at some point, way, I don't know, 8 years later, I ended up breaking it. I got another one. When I opened it up, it was broken in the case. I was like, ah! But for me, the problem was because it's such a huge tool, I can't put it in any of my containers. I literally had to make something out of acrylic just to put in a water sample to put the hydrometer in to get my measurement, because I can't put it in my tank because a hydrometer has to sit very in quiet water. if the flow is happening, the thing keeps moving, you can't read it. You need it to be in a nice dead pool of water. Now, if you have a big, nice 55-gallon barrel of salt water, you could put the hydrometer in there perfectly. There's all that depth for the hydrometer to hang down in. You can unplug the pumps and let it sit still, and you get a good reading. Totally can do it. And I do know it is considered one of the peak choices, the premier choices when it comes to getting a super scientific, accurate measurement. But for me, the benefit didn't really outweigh the practicality of my life, and so I prefer the refractometer. It's a lot quicker for me. Diacanthus Reef says, I highly recommend a brewer's float hydrometer in a graduated cylinder. So maybe that's a slightly smaller one than the one from Tropic Marin. I haven't seen it. Unapologetic review show says, what about switching salts? Going slow is recommended. What's your process? I have changed salt brands over the years, and I've never ever had to mix the two brands together. Like, for example, when I went from Red Sea Pro Reef and switched to Sibon, I didn't take 50% Pro Reef and 50% Sibon and combine them into a barrel to make salt water. I have chosen in the past to do a slightly smaller water change with a newer salt, but I didn't have a real good reason for it, because essentially all salt mixes really should be the same. They aren't, but they should be. They have certain things that are the same. Calcium chloride is in both batches. Levels of iron are in both batches. Calcium sulfate is in there. Magnesium sulfide is in there. Magnesium chloride is in there. Chlorine is. There's a lot of different elements in every batch of salt, but their recipes all are different. It's sort of like buying 5 different flavors of chocolate chip cookies. They're all chocolate chip cookies, but they all taste a little different. So if you are changing a part of the water in your aquarium with one brand of salt versus another brand of salt, it really shouldn't be an impact unless the new brand of salt is seriously lacking something that the old brand carried. And the only way to know that is to use it. So if you were saying, well, I've got this new salt, but I know I know for a fact the alkalinity is much lower than the other one. Well, again, in my situation, I said always bring the alkalinity up to match your tank. So I'd be buffering it up anyway to get that to work. But if you had a batch of salt that was lower in magnesium than the batch you always used. Like, for example, I used Sibon for so many years, 4 or 5 years, and every bag, the magnesium level was 1,600. I didn't have to dose a drop of magnesium for 3 years because it was always up. It couldn't come down because every new batch of salt water went in, kept it up high. But then when I switched to Aquavitro salinity, their magnesium was lower, and I found myself needing to dose magnesium ever since. And it's not a lot. I put in something like 60 to 80 milliliters a day with a dosing pump, and once a month I refill the jug with magnesium solution. And then when I switched from salinity to Fritz, again, I just continued to use magnesium. And if the number gets a little too high, per either my own manual testing or an ICP test result that comes in, like, oh, it's definitely getting a little bit high, I can just stop dosing magnesium. I literally set it to 0, and the doser doesn't come on. And then after about 2 weeks or so, then I resume dosing again to kind of make sure it doesn't drop down too low. But I've never had a situation where I went from one salt mix to another one and had it affect my reef. The reef, and maybe it's because I don't do water changes all the time. Maybe because I'm doing it less frequently, the corals and fish are just grateful I finally did some water changing. Thomas says, I have 5 more sessions of physical therapy to go. Then I'll be able to do water changes again. Will my tank be okay for a while longer until I'm able to do water changes? Yes. Yes, your tank will be okay. I do want to say this out loud. Diacanthus Reef said, I use a brewer's hydrometer, highly recommended for them or by them, in a graduated cylinder, but be mindful of the measurement unit model you buy if you don't care for converting it yourself. So that way you can find out what it is. And he says his is in bricks. What is bricks? I don't know that. I'd have to look it up. Hey, Thomas, thank you for the super chat. I appreciate that. And yes, you'll be okay. Your tank will be okay. You don't have to worry about it. Just let everything just sit there, and it can idle. A lot of people neglect their tanks for months and months and months, and then they finally get around to it. As long as you're feeding your tank and make sure it's getting topped off, it'll be okay without a water change until you feel better. I see Amanda here, and Jason's here. Reef Keeper says, I chipped my glass once from pouring in the bucket. I always pump it in from now on, or pump it in now. And yeah, that's a bummer. I mean, it's crazy that a bucket could chip glass, but it must have been the perfect scenario for that to happen. I'll tell you that, you should always be careful when you're holding a bucket near your aquarium that the metal handles, the part here, that this doesn't make impact with the glass or with the acrylic, because it'll leave a scratch. And so, you always want to make sure that this part of the bucket, the plastic, is what's making contact with your aquarium, if at all. But if you use a pump to push it in, the bucket's on the floor, you're safe, your back is safe, and your tank is safe. Goalie Mask says, came in a bit late because I was doing a water change. Nice. Oh, thank you, Reef Keeper. Yeah, I was talking about using some kind of way to hook the tubing on. I didn't even think about the Python hook. Yeah, that'd be handy. But if you can find that attachment easily on Amazon or something, you could get that and put that on your tubing. That would be a sweet way to get water back in. Michael says, when I do water changes, I pull water from my sump and put in fresh salt water back in my sump. Is that a good idea? Yeah, that's how I do mine. I pump it out of the sump, I refill the sump, and I turn the return pump back on. Oh, hey, here's something that's important that I didn't mention earlier. Super important. I hope that whoever chose to watch this didn't blow off the Q&A part of this video at this point. But your heaters, they should never be exposed to air. If you have heaters in your sump and you're pumping the water out because you're cleaning and the heaters are exposed, they need to be unplugged for the duration of the water change. And then you absolutely need to remember to plug them back in when things are back in operation. And unfortunately, two things happen. People unplug the heaters and forget to plug them in, and the tank gets too cold later on. And they're like, why is my tank getting so cold? And they're like, oh my God, I never plugged in the heaters. Okay, now that's something you can overcome. You can tell your smart device to give you a reminder to plug the heaters in. You can set a timer, and when the timer goes off, you plug your heaters in. You can use the controller you have, like an Apex or Hydros, to switch the heaters to off. But then again, you must remember to turn them back on. Or maybe you've got the code in the switch to where you can say, and this is a thing, it's totally doable, but you usually need help. You program the controller to turn this off, but it will automatically resume in X amount of minutes. So for example, let's say I've got code in my Apex system for water changes. And when it's time to do a water change, I push a button on the side of my stand and I hold it in, and then it kicks into water change mode. My return pump turns off, my top off turns off, my heaters turn off, my skimmer turns off, all the alarms turn off because there's going to be a change of water. And then I pump everything out, I pump everything in, and then after basically about 40 minutes, everything comes back on, and then after about another 5 minutes or so, then the skimmer comes back on. And in this way, I'm able to pump water out, pump water in. I don't get a bunch of alerts on my phone that the temperature's wrong and the pH is wrong and the salinity is wrong and all these things because the probes are all exposed to air. I don't worry about the heaters getting exposed to air to where they could burn up. Now, my heaters are in a very specific spot in the sump where they're always submerged no matter what I'm doing. I made a thing called a heater hanger that sits between the baffles of my sump, and the water in the section between the baffles is full, always. I can pump all the water out of this side, and I can pump all the water out of this side, but that spot between the baffles is full of 12 inches of water, and my heaters are stacked right there in that 12 inches of water, and they never are exposed to air, so I don't have to worry about it. But if you have heaters on the bottom of your sump, maybe they're under the protein skimmer, or they're near the return pump, or they're angled slightly because they're so long because you have the wrong size in your sump, and as you're draining the water out, the heater element is exposed to air, and if the heater's plugged in and turned on or activates itself because the Inkbird told it to turn on, because the thermostat probe that was in your sump was exposed to air because you pumped the water out, so it turned the heater on. See what I'm saying? We want the heaters unplugged or switched to off during the water change, and then afterwards turn them back on. If you don't disable the heaters, and I talked about forgetting to turn them on, the other end of it is if you let them turn on while they're exposed to air, they can crack, they can break, they can burst, and you could get hit with shrapnel. And of course, you got to deal with cleaning up the mess in your sump from the broken glass everywhere. So you want to make sure that your heaters are somewhere safe. Now, if you're doing a deep clean of the sump, unplug the heaters first or set them to off, however you want to do it, and then put them out of the sump in a bucket where they can't get stepped on or broken by any means possible because they're in a safe, enclosed area. I love sticking stuff in a bucket where I know I'm not going to trip over it or knock it over or bump it. It's just a smart move. And that way I can go in my sump and I can really clean. I can scrape all the walls down. I can scrape vermintide off the bottom of my sump. I can vacuum out all the detritus, whether I use that little attachment or I just use a shop vac and really get everything out. And then I've got a nice pristine sump. And then at this point I can reset. I can put the skimmer back in. I can put the heaters back into their spot. I can put whatever, all the things go back in the sump and I refill it with water and then I start plugging things in or turning things on again. But the automation of having something that you shut off automatically resume again after a certain amount of minutes is a wonderful tool. And if you haven't figured out how to do that yet, learn. Because once you've learned it, you're going to love it. Like, let's say, for example, you want to take the collection cup off your protein skimmer so you can clean it. Well, if you have a switch that will basically turn off the skimmer for a fixed amount of minutes that you choose. You might say, I need 5 minutes. You might say, I need 12 minutes. You might say, I need 37 minutes to do this job. You program it 37 minutes. You hit the button or you hit a little trigger inside the app or whatever you're going to do. And the skimmer's water drops inside the body. Great, it's off. You take the cup off. You go to the sink. You're cleaning it. You're scrubbing it. You're making sure everything's fine. You bring it back. You put it back on top. And then the skimmer comes back to life automatically on its own. You don't have to remember to take the phone out of your pocket and switch it back to on. Or switch it to on and now switch it back to auto. That's another thing, that sometimes people make mistakes and they set it to on and it never turns off. And then when the skimmer's going crazy because it's overflowing and it's draining water all over the place, or it's spattering everything in your stand, or it's overflowing onto the floor and it won't shut off because you didn't leave it in auto. That's a really important setting. So you want to make sure, and that specifically would be Apex related, but odds are there's something like that in Hydros as well. But having things that you can turn off for a duration that will automatically turn back to the on position is really great to avoiding forgetting to turn things back on that you need to do. And if you don't use controllers, if you're old school, write a post-it, turn on heater, and stick it on the glass of the aquarium. That way while you're working underneath, then when you stand up, you're looking at your tank, oh yeah, and you take the post-it off and you plug the heater in. You could try to say, I'll remember, but you might forget. Laura Thornton says, I picked up a Tuna Sun per Ryan from BRS recommendation as my refugium light, and now I have a giant ball of Chaetomorpha and coralline covering the entire refugium, and 0 green hair algae or pest algae. That sounds perfect. Now, the Chaetomorpha that's growing, at some point, you're going to need to pull some out. Usually, and a giant ball is great. If it's filling the entire refugium towards a brick, that's too much. You want to then pull out about 25%. You remove that, either give it to the fish store for them to give it to someone else or sell to someone else, or you throw it away. And usually, generally speaking, when you pull out algae, the thought is you take the algae, you freeze it in your freezer overnight, and then you throw it away. So that way there's no way that algae can somehow cause a problem out there in the real world once it gets to the dump. It's just a thing, okay? Just bringing it up. But when you've pulled out 25%, then you pull apart what's left to make it less dense so water can flow through it. You might even turn it over to allow it to light on the other side of it. It just helps the Chaetomorpha grow more abundantly. Same thing with Caulerpa. If you take out 25%, you just want to break it up a little bit to encourage flow through the tank again. Thomas says, I've never cleaned my sump. It's been going for 4 years. I didn't know that was something I needed to do or not. it just comes down to personal opinion. I mean, you might look down there and say it looks good. Or you might say, yeah, there's a lot of detritus in there. I'd like to get that out. I've done different tricks in the past to try to remove it. Like I'd take a plastic bowl and I'd set it in the bottom of the sump because I'd remove equipment first. So I just have a sump with water. And then I might take like a credit card and I would scrape all the detritus to the front and try to lift the card and the sludge and pour that into the bowl and then scrape and pour the sludge and keep doing that over and over. And you can get the majority of it out that way. That's a very manual method that cleans the sump. A shop vac is way easier, and I know people do that. They'll just pump it all out and just slurp it clean. That's another method. And then, of course, the little VCA attachment I showed you is a nice way to vacuum it out while the system is running, and you're not losing a lot of water in the process. Larry says, do you grow macroalgae in your sump, or do you use a reactor to grow the keto? I have a certain type of caulerpa in my refugium that I've had forever. And it's not crazy dense like it was in the old days, and that's because of my algae turf scrubber. It's definitely doing something in competition to the refugium. But I've been growing the same weed for 20 plus years. It never goes sexual, never a problem. I light it 9 hours a day, and it just does its thing. I thought it was going to die off completely from the scrubber, but it has not. Santana Reef says you don't want it perfectly level. You know, that's a valid point, and that's something I thought of too. You want it to be slightly sloped to encourage the water to go away, but fortunately the water's going to go off the boards and down. But the boards I'm using are the composite ones that last forever. So worst case scenario in my brain is that I get water spots. Maybe. We'll see. But I do want it to be relatively level, so it doesn't feel like I'm just rolling off the deck when I'm walking, to the side. But I'm very excited to get that done. It's been something I've been wanting for 2 years. Jason says, too cold for working outside? We're a balmy 48 today, so I put up all of our Christmas lights with no coat and no gloves. Well, I mean, look. This morning, it was 31 out. Okay, it was cold. It was below freezing. And Monday will be like 71, which would be the perfect day for me to work on the deck. But that is the final day of coral, and I know I'll be busy with that, which really is a bummer because the next day after that, the temperature drops 25 degrees, and it's like, ugh. I just want to be comfortable when I'm out there working, that's all. That's why I wanted to do it before winter came. I just didn't have the opportunity, and I finally need to make the time to make this happen, and at least I'm not doing it in February. I'm notorious for doing things in the worst, August when it's 1,000 degrees outside, or February when it's freezing cold out. I always tend to do these stupid projects then, and I'm glad I'm not doing it at that point. And if I can get this thing buttoned up over, even if I work on it a little bit each day and just get the planks on there, that'll be so nice. I'm really looking forward to getting this done. Thank you, Emmanuel. He says, it's 60 degrees here in NorCal, and I don't want to do stuff outside either. Thank you. Yes, you get me. Goalie Mass says, how do you recommend changing salts from a low alk to a higher brand? It's pretty easy. Just switch. It's okay. It is okay to switch salts. I have probably used 7 different brands over the years. I'm trying to think. Obviously, I started with Instant Ocean. That was what you got back in the day. And then I think I went from that to... I never used Reef Crystals, which is the same company, by the way. I think I went from Instant Ocean to something before I used Red Sea. Yeah, Red Sea Pro Reef. That is correct. There was a period of about 9 months I used a brand of salt called Oceanic, and then I hated it, and I got rid of it. I stopped. I was like, nope, never again. And then I used Cybon. There's some other brand I'm forgetting, and I used Aquavitra. Now I've been using Fritz for the last few years, no problem at all. I've gone through boxes and boxes of salt, so I mean, I'm no problem at all with Fritz. But I can't think of that other salt I used to use. I feel like there's one more. Oh, Kent sea salt. I used Kent. Kent was a huge debacle at one point. There was one bad batch that went out to the nation and affected thousands of hobbyists, and the problem was that batch had no alkalinity in the barrel. Like when you mixed it up and you measured, it was like 1 DKH. It was crazy low. But because of my method of matching salinity, temperature, and at that time pH, I said, wow, my pH is really low. Let me buffer it up. And when I buffered it up, I was actually buffering up the alkalinity without knowing my alkalinity was low. I just knew the pH was ridiculously low. And I was thinking, I guess because it's dead of winter, I've got the house all sealed up. There must be tons of CO2 in here. I have a dog. I got me. I got my kid. I had a roommate at one point. And all these people, I just thought were really depressing the pH. And so I just had to buffer it up to get my water to be 8.2 like my tank. And when I was doing that, I was fixing my alkalinity, not knowing it was totally lacking. And I was changing my water. My reef went completely unaffected. I had no problem when everyone else was losing their tanks. And as they were losing their tanks, what did they do? They did more and more water changes thinking that'll fix it because water changes always fix a problem. But they were fixing it with bad water, repeatedly changing water, never had alkalinity, and their tanks were crashing left and right, literally losing all the livestock. That is what I call a crash. And I had a store from Arkansas call me up, and he says, Mark, you using Kent sea salt? And I was like, yeah. He goes, go check your alkalinity right now. I was like, what, how? He's like, just mix up a batch and tell me what you get and call me back. So I mixed up a gallon or 5 gallons or something, and I checked. I was like, wow, it's 1.0. And he was like, I knew it. He goes, I'm going to burn that company to the ground. He was super mad. He had an 800-gallon reef tank in his store that was his pride and joy. It was his showpiece. And he'd been doing tons of water changes, and the tank just got worse and worse after every water change. And he finally tested his water and found out what was wrong. Well, I got lucky in that case. But then, as many of you know, a few years ago, I didn't get lucky when I was doing water changes and my tank just went downhill. And I was like, what is happening? And through a lot of testing, I discovered that my salt mix was lacking potassium. It was very, very low, like 50% of what it should have been, which was a huge effect on the tank. And my reef was struggling, and everything green had turned brown. I was losing corals left and right. I mean, it was a disaster. And when I found out what I was lacking, I literally dosed the potassium in the tank for the next 3 weeks. Not a water change. Just put in 3 liters of potassium over 3 weeks, and the entire tank recovered because it got back what it was needing. If it had been low in alkalinity and I had corals that could survive that, I'd been dosing alkalinity for 3 weeks to get it where it needs to be. It's the same principle. It was just a weird thing that it was potassium. But I let the company know. They ended up replacing my barrel with a new barrel of salt, and the old salt I got rid of. I shipped it back to them for studying, and they definitely agreed. Yeah, something wasn't right in my batch for whatever reason. So it can happen with any brand. Tropic Marin got hit a few years ago with an accusation about problems with their salt, and a lot of people were upset. There's no company that's immune. So ultimately, testing your water and matching your water to your aquarium is always your safest bet. When my tank, like I said, I had something bad happen to mine, I wasn't measuring potassium like a test kit. That's something you do on your ICP test occasionally. And so there was no way I could have anticipated that one. It's sort of like me wanting to do a water change and not knowing I had a lack of iodine or a lack of strontium. I wouldn't know that. That's not a thing I test for. And so if it was hopelessly low in that element, I would do my water change anyway. I wouldn't know. Someday I'd do an ICP test, and they would say your strontium's really low, and I'd be dosing strontium, not knowing it was because of the salt mix or whatever. I would have attributed it to, wow, my reef really consumes strontium. I had no idea. Let me put more in. That kind of thing. But there's really, realistically, changing salt from one brand to another shouldn't be an issue. But if you're trying to be cautious, there's nothing wrong with that. You can just do smaller water changes over the next few water changes. You know, if you're doing a water change once a week and you're doing 25 gallons at a time, maybe for now you just do 10-gallon water changes each week and just kind of watch the livestock and see how it goes. But at some point, you're going to be like, you know, everything's fine. I'm going to do my 25-gallon water change again. It's totally fine. And my reef tank doesn't care. And that could very well be the case. That's usually the case. Ugly Reefer says, can Coral Magazine be shipped overseas to Germany? It absolutely can. And by the way, because you are in Germany, there is a version called Korale, K-O-R-A-L-L-E. So you could get that subscription in German, and then you could read the English one, which is different than the German one. There are some redundancy because we're licensed to use their articles, so just so you know. But if you're enjoying reading in English, yes, we can definitely ship to you in Germany. Amanda says it was an awesome follow-up interview on the yellow tang release in Hawaii. Yes, that is a huge article, very exciting. We interviewed multiple people to build that story, and it's ginormous. It literally replaced our normal Reef Notebook section of Coral Magazine this time because we had so much to say, so much to go into about what was accomplished with adding some yellow tangs to the ocean. Steve Charles says you can adjust the saltwater calculator app. It must be a different app than what I'm using. I'm using the Hamza calculator, but that one only gives me choices of pounds and kilos and grams. That's it. There's nothing about cups. But there could be a different one. I'm sure there's other calculators out there. Randy Ruiz says, what about using salinity like 1.020 for LRFO tanks? Live rock fish only? Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, lower salinity could help with disease control. It's one of the reasons the fish stores do it. But the other reason the fish stores keep their salinity a little bit lower is it saves them some money. Because salt is not free. And Adam says, buying live rock and getting it shipped overnight was the best thing I ever did for my tank. That's what I believe. I feel the same way. If I can't buy it locally, I want it shipped overnight. And Marco Rock has just... They've got a new thing happening in 2025. So they have taken their Reef Saver rock, they put it in the ocean for a couple of years, and they're bringing it into their greenhouses on land, and they've got them in these raceways of saltwater, and they're under lighting and everything to color them up and make them pretty. And then they're going to ship it in bags of water, as far as I know. And they're going to be shipping the live rock just like they do fish and corals. So, just like fish and corals are shipped. So you're going to get life on it with no die-off, which is fantastic. Trav says, I did a water change today. I don't feel guilty watching. Yay. That's funny. Triggerfish says, I believe you mentioned the yellow tang story on the last live stream and said they had an excess, so they released them. They couldn't just put them up for sale. Correct. They were not allowed to sell them. So the organizers behind it were, they just said, oh, you have too many? Okay, you could release them into the ocean. But it wasn't just to take some fish down to the ocean and let them free like Finding Nemo. It wasn't like that. There was a whole process, and the story goes into that. I hope you guys enjoy it in Coral. I don't want to say too much. I don't want to steal from the magazine. I put too much effort putting things into it. I want all of you to be subscribers. I hope you are. I don't know that you are, because I don't know usernames to real names, and I don't even know the list of subscribers. That's not my job. My job is to build a fantastic magazine, and I work very hard at it, and I drive everyone crazy on my team. I know I do. Because I always want to put in more and more and more. Triggerfish says, I'm sure a lot of people are waiting for the sub $300 yellow tang. Okay, you can wait. Maybe someday we'll be able to get fish out of Hawaii again. I know that they're still struggling to overturn a decision that was made by a judge to get permission to export some. And the last thing I read was that there was a discussion, a possibility of some portion of the Hawaii fishery being reopened, but then they could only export like 6 or 8 species of fish. So it wasn't going to be just anything in Hawaii. It was going to be very specific to a certain, to certain species. And it hasn't happened yet. It's still an ongoing thing. He said maybe it was a political stunt for good optics to get activists off their backs. No, it wasn't that either. You're going to have to read the story. Ortega says, when do I change my RODI filter? All right, that's a great question. Totally changing the subject. I love it. RO filters, the 3 filters are usually, depends what system you have. In my brain, I'm thinking of the one I sell, which has got 3 housings underneath and then a membrane on top, and then I have a separate DI afterwards. And the pre-filter, which is the sediment filter, and the carbon filter or the carbon block, those should be replaced every 6 months. That should just be like changing the filter on your air conditioner. You want to replace the filters every 6 months because those filters protect the membrane on the top from damage. That thing on the top is where all the work happens. The filters don't do all the work. Everyone thinks, I got to change the filters, I got to change the filters, I got to change the filters. Yes, you do to protect the membrane. But the membrane's what's removing everything from the water to get it nice and pure. And then what little bit of stuff is left coming out of the membrane gets captured in the DI resin. The DI filter you change as needed based on TDS levels. So let's say your water coming in from the city is 200, and you've measured that with a TDS meter, and you've been making water every few days or once a week, and you're typically making 20 to 30 gallons of water a week. So you can have water for water changes, so you can have water for top off. So you're averaging somewhere around 120 to 125 gallons of water you make each month. And if you're making that much water, then in 6 months, it's time to change those filters underneath. The pre-filters have to be replaced. So you replace the sediment and the carbons. Then the membrane is good for a few years. It could be as low as 1 year. It could be as much as 5 years. And basically, the only way to know when it's time to change the membrane is based on TDS measurements again. So by measuring the TDS of the water coming out of the membrane, and of course, noting how long it takes to make water, if the TDS goes up crazy high suddenly, like if it was always coming out at 6 and now it's coming out at 66, the membrane's done. Or if you were always making 5 gallons of water an hour and now you barely can make half a gallon and it takes like all day to make 5 gallons of water, the membrane's done. So that's it. Either the number's crazy high or no water's coming out. That's when you replace the membrane. The DI, well, you want the water to be pure. You want it to be 0 TDS going into your aquarium. So when the number rises to 1, 2, or 3, that's when I replace my DI resin. I don't need to be 0 all the time. 0 is fine. 0 is my goal. But if it gets to 1, I just kind of let it keep going. And I might be 1 for a month. And then finally it creeps up to 2. I'm like, all right, I'll go get the new DI resin and pop it in. So that's how I look at it. Oh, by the way, if you have to replace the membrane, when you put the new one in, it's like the day you set up your RODI system. You've got to run it for a solid hour, let it push out whatever whatever comes out for an hour, which is usually 5 gallons of water, and then throw that away. Because inside the membrane, which is this blue rolled up fabric, that's why it's called a membrane, it's full of food grade preservative. And so while you run that for the first hour, you're flushing all that food grade preservative out, and you definitely don't want to drink it. You don't want your pets to drink it. You just pour it out. You can pour it onto the lawn. That's okay. You can pour it down the toilet if you want. It's just not good for your aquarium. And then after that first hour, now all the water coming out is totally fine. You do not need to rinse your pre-filters. You do not need to rinse your DI. The only thing that gets flushed is that membrane, and it has to run for a solid hour. And I use the word flush because that was just what popped in my brain. But basically, you just turn on the system, you let it run for an hour. And when I'm doing that with a brand new membrane, I don't even install the DI yet. So I've hooked it up. Typically when you replace your membrane, you're like, I'm just going to replace all my filters at the same time. So you put in your brand new pre-filters, you put in your brand new membrane. Don't put in the DI. Turn it on, let it run for an hour. Now the membrane's been cleared of all that stuff I described. Now you can install your DI and you can start making water for your aquarium. That's it. Hopefully that makes sense and doesn't overwhelm you. Santana says I should have done a half pergola over the thing. I really want a pergola, but I could not figure out a way to connect it to the house. I kept thinking about it, and I was like, you know what? Let me just get the deck built. Maybe later on I can add a pergola. But yeah, I would like to have that right over where you first walk out. I think that'd be really nice. My Pet World says, I'm listening while doing my water changes. I have 4 reef aquariums and 2 more to go. And then Kevin says, I just did a large water change yesterday, 40 gallons and 120 gallon. Today is water test day. Yes, it is. So that is what we're going to lead into. This one right here. Water tests do save lives. It's super important that you test your water of your aquarium because if you know all the parameters, if something's lacking, you can make an adjustment. You can figure out why it's lacking. Maybe one of your dosing pumps isn't dosing like it was. Maybe one of your solutions is empty and needs to be refilled. If you're using automatic testing, like the Trident, for example, or an Alcatronic or one of those, you want to make sure all those solutions are up to date and filled up. If you haven't calibrated in a while, it might be time to calibrate to make sure your numbers are accurate. I use 2 Tridents on my 400-gallon reef. One measures alkalinity, calcium and magnesium. The other one measures nitrate and phosphate. And I've been watching my phosphate closely and keeping it under control using Phosphate RX. My alkalinity and calcium come from my calcium reactor, so I don't have to think about that. My magnesium comes from a jug of magnesium pronto that I fill up about once a month, and I just make sure that that is trickling in properly and that it's not being precipitated out into the system by dosing it too quickly. So it's that easy. And if you're keeping up with all your water testing, then your livestock should look great. And if it's not looking great, let me know and I'll see what I can do to help you. Guys, I hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend. If you need to buy anything from my shop, please do it because you're supporting my business. This is the end of the year. I could use some income. I always appreciate it when you guys do a little shopping at milovesreef.com. And I hope that you guys have a nice weekend. I'll see you again next week. Bye.